Hey, welcome back. This is going to be a long-form video tutorial for Unraid 0 to Hero. Now, I've lost track of how many attempts this is, but this is kind of attempt 4.5. Bunch of audio issues along the way, but it's all in a day's work. This is going to be me going through Unraid. There's a lot of things that I've taken for granted over the years, a lot of things that aren't explained the best, understandably, but I will attempt to show you a golden path, and this should help anyone who's trying to get into this avoid some of the issues that can crop up. I'm going to play one of the versions of this tutorial that worked most of the way and dub over it and let basically past me do the majority of the work. So let's see what we have here. So that was me going through the first part, which is logging in, but before that you need to get a USB stick. I recommend the Kioxia U366 if I remember correctly. It's an all-metal USB key, and the reason I recommend it is because what tends to kill your USB over time isn't reads or writes. Very few, almost none, are done to the USB key. It just holds the configuration file for the OS, essentially. What kills it, in my experience, has been heat. The plastic enclosed USB keys don't radiate heat or wick it away fast enough, especially the ones that tout being USB 3.0. They tend to get hot, and the plastic insulates that heat, and it doesn't end well for something that's usually plugged into the rear of a server. So I recommend the Kioxia U366. I'll leave a link in the description, and let's go on. So one of the first things I do is set the number of drives on the main page. The reason I do this is because I don't want to have to scroll all the time. Now, the interface is designed such that you have 2 parity drives and the rest are array drives. Currently, Unraid supports only 1 array. Now, you can have other pools outside of this array, but 1 array running Fuse, as it's known, or SHFS. This is relatively easy to set up. Forgive me, my camera is currently overlaying the array. So, these are drives that I have previously pre-cleared. Now, what is a pre-clear? A pre-clear is a process of verifying that a drive is relatively safe, and what it does is it takes a disk and puts it into the system, mounts it onto the system as an unassigned device, and it goes through a process of reading the entire platter of the disk, writing every block to be 0, followed by reading and verifying that every block has been correctly changed to 0. Essentially scanning the platter for any issues and making sure that the read head, write, everything is in order. The maximum number of pre-clears that you can schedule in one go is 3, and I personally like to stick to the safe side in this respect and do a triple pre-clear on each disk before putting it into the array. Just make sure that you don't have any dead on arrival or nearly dead on arrival disks. So I've done that to all my disks, and for the sake of cutting to the chase, there's no parity drive, there's no parity that needs to be computed or analyzed. They're just there as individual disks, a sort of JBOD. So you can see there that there are some Micron SSDs. Those will make up the bulk of the caching. And there have been some changes since this video was done. I'll fill you guys in the later tutorials. So a methodology that I've developed over time is I name my pools, keep in mind pools are separate from the array. I name them after the NATO alphabet. I generally start from both ends, alpha being the pool that is dedicated to the array. Well, it's not necessarily dedicated to the array. It's a legacy idea that it used to be dedicated to the array, but now it's kind of like pools are their standalone thing, and they all work with the array. You'll see as time goes on. I name them from both ends in respect to the NATO alphabet, so alpha down to Zulu. And generally, I keep alpha as standalone, and I might use it as a app data cache or something to that respect. And Zulu will be the ZFS array, like RAID Z1, something that's got a good fault tolerance, but at the same time is quite large. So here I'm just making the ZFS pool out of the Micron drives. Speed this up slightly. So here I'm selecting ZFS encrypted and a RAID Z1. Oh, and I'm enabling compression as of the current date. The compression on essentially means LZ4 compression. Now, you'll notice that I use X data center drives for the majority of this. Reason being that the ones that come out of the data center are significantly more durable than the ones that you would get for as a consumer. So these Micron 5200s are rated to something like maybe 2 or 3 drive writes per day, whereas a consumer drive might be rated to only about half. It's not necessary, but that is one aspect of why I do this. Another thing is that when it comes to IO latency, they're significantly snappier. This isn't something that you're going to realize as a user or as a client, but when it comes to a database that's running on the SSD, for example, if I was to run Plex on this, it would have its own internal SQLite databases, or if I was to run Image with a Postgres database, those things are going to be far more noticeable in terms of performance than any sequential benchmark is going to show you. So I personally prefer to get my drives used on eBay because they come with more life expectancy than a brand new consumer drive in general, and they tend to perform better overall, especially when it comes to sustained workloads. Consumer drives are fantastic for burst situations, but when it comes to like, for example, I pre-cleared these SSDs. It's not necessary, but I did it anyway, and they sustained about the same write speeds and read speeds throughout the entire drive. If you were to do this with a consumer drive, you wouldn't have the same outcome. You'd have a fantastically high top speed, and then it would simmer down to something a little bit lower than reasonable, but still absolutely fine for normal use cases. So, that's me putting my Samsung, I think PM9, I can't remember what model it is, but it's a Samsung drive. Gotta speed through here a little bit. Oh, and I forgot to mention, as far as the USB stick goes for Unraid, don't bother with anything more than 32 gigs. Just don't. It makes absolutely no use of that whatsoever. With my most exuberant of Unraid configurations with multiple, wild and unnecessary adjustments. The most I got was about 500 megabytes. Okay. So when it comes to adding new disks to the array, you'll notice that the array disks, they just popped right in. It didn't ask for formatting. Reason being, that Unraid signature that I mentioned before. Pre-clearing isn't mandated, but the signature is also written when adding new disks to the array, or disks that haven't been formatted. So here we can see that the Micron disks and the Samsung NVMe drive are not formatted, and here it is prompting us to format it. So this occurs when you start the array, and it detects that they're not formatted. So you click the checkbox near the bottom. You may not have seen that, but you click the checkbox near the bottom, and then on the left, you click, yes, I want to format this. There we go. Generally, I like to select an encrypted file system, regardless of the drive or wherever, just because. Better to be safe than sorry. Oh, yes. The documentation on the Unraid site recommends XFS for the array disks, and if I remember correctly, BTRFS for the cache pools. Now, this is an Unraid recommendation. Anything outside of this is in your own hands, but relatively stable. By relatively stable, I mean it's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. I personally have chosen ZFS for the array pools because this is my semi-test server. I wanted to see if using ZFS on the pools allowed those disks to have data pulled onto Arc. And from my testing, it seems that this is the case, but I'm not going to confirm that just yet. Now, keep in mind, this does come with the con of not being able to defragment the drives after the fact. So, what do we have here? Default spin down. Okay, so this comes down to personal preference. I personally set the default spin down to 15 minutes because the majority of the time I'm the only person using my array, and everything for the large part is cached when it comes to writes and reads. So, or cache backed, I should say. So when it comes to new writes to the array, they go onto the SSD and then eventually they get flushed to disk. And spinning them down after 15 minutes, it saves me a lot of power and cost. Now, these are the default temperature parameters. They apply to all disks. For NVMEs, especially the one in my system, it's going to be a little warmer than a 2U with high power blowers. So I set the default a little bit higher. For hard drives, anything up until 50 degrees Celsius is okay. After that, you should be a little bit concerned. So what I'm doing here is, I think, setting up not exclusive shares, but a fuse bypass, at least in part. So all the applications, not quite all, but the vast majority of applications you see on the Community Applications tab, also known as just the Apps tab, are supported and created by the community. They are not integrated into the operating system, allowing the Unraid guys to be a little bit more flexible and a little bit more progressive with their updates. So this is just me downloading some of the more important applications, such as auto-update applications, unassigned devices. If you're going to get this, go ahead and get the other two, the add-on and pre-clear. And that should allow you to pre-clear your drives at that point. Now, here we are at the Docker settings, and what I'm going to do here is pretty much just bypass what's known as Fuse, also known as SHFS. Fuse is what allows Unraid to take multiple drives and have them present on an SMB or NFS share as a single device, or a single file system, I should say. Excuse me. So what I'm doing here is essentially I'm taking the app data, which by default is going to put itself onto the array, and I'm pushing it onto the pool here named alpha. Now, that is something that I show here by selecting the primary storage to be, I think I showed here. Yep, I select it to be alpha, and then I select secondary storage to be array, and then I select the direction that it moves it using mover action. So as you can see there, alpha, array, and with the arrow going to alpha. And then clicking mover down at the bottom of the main page initiates the mover, and the mover moves that data. However, in hindsight, I would have made one change here. So if you take a look further on in the video, I go ahead and speed this up, you'll see that I also do this for things like the domain, ISOs, and whatnot. I have adjusted this since then, such that the data for everything that appears by default other than app data is on Zulu, which has a RAID Z1 tolerance. The reason I don't add fault tolerance to cache alpha is because it's supposed to be a low latency, high IO throughput pool. So I put my applications on it, and it's the single NVMe drive in the system, and it's pretty much going to get brutalized. And rather than adding redundancy to it, I have an effective backup strategy that will put backups onto Zulu and backups offsite. So I'm not worried about losing the alpha pool. So there is me just explaining some things. So the things that I moved to Cache Zulu were domains, ISOs, and system. App data I left on the single NVMe, which is alpha. Oh, another thing to note. Cache to cache moving is not something that's implemented in Unraid. If you cannot move a share, let's call them a share, from one cache to another cache directly, unless you do it manually. That's via command line or via a file system editing app like Crusader. So if you want to move these via the mover, you have to move them from the array. So here's just a little situation of a bit of a share getting stuck on a disk, and I fixed that down the line. So going through the Docker settings here, some things I'm going to change. So I mentioned in passing Fuse. Fuse allows all those disks to appear as a single file system or a single item of storage. Fuse is fantastic, but sometimes we don't want it. For example, on our pools or cache-only shares. So there are some things that you can do here to rectify that. One of the things is to go to the shares and then enable exclusive mode. This means that any share, which is a software-defined body of data that is set to only exist on a cache pool, now is exclusively accessed, meaning it doesn't have to go through the Fuse translation layer in order to access the data on the other side. It accesses the drive or disk directly, so to speak. Any of the IO that goes through /user, then / whatever the share name is going through Fuse. Essentially, that user part in the middle is Fuse. So here we have mnt/user/app data for the default app data storage location. This is fine. I personally see a big performance difference, especially when it comes to starting up and shutting down Docker containers, and especially if you enable, this is a little bit anecdotal, some people won't have this issue, but if you have a large library of Plex data and you enable the default settings of video preview thumbnails, which generate one video preview thumbnail per every second of video, you're going to see your SQLite database in Plex balloon. And before you hit the limit of SQLite database size, you hit an awkward spot in Fuse access times. It becomes very slow in terms of IO, and that is a perfect example of a time to bypass Fuse. And doing so is relatively simple. You just change the path to being the direct path to the disk, which would be, instead of /mnt/user/app data, for me it would be /mnt/alpha/app data. So here I am enabling exclusive shares. And like the explainer says, the performance bump is significant. You cannot do this to anything that touches the array, however. So another thing I like to do is expanding the Docker vdisk size. 50 gigabytes isn't much these days, but it allows a significant amount of vdisks. Vdisks? God, container terminology sometimes escapes me. It's Docker images, images for containers to be kept on the system. So here I am adjusting some of the paths. I think I skipped over some of those parts, but overall, this is the meat and potatoes. I'm going through this rather quickly, just so we can cover the main topics, or the main parts, all the parts where you hit next and go on to the next square. I'm breezing past, and apologies if you do end up needing some of those. So, Crusader is an application that lets you view the file system from a user interface and perform file moves that are local to the file system. So you don't have to, you're not moving them over shares or using the command line. It makes management a little bit easier, especially when you get to the more complex things. There's some things that I've done to optimize my system using Crusader. Now, another tool that you can use in the stead of Crusader is, I can't remember the name of it, but I will leave the information for it in the description of the video. Unbalanced, that's what it's called, Unbalanced. However, that one does take a little bit more setting up than this. So here I'm manually moving files that are located in the shares instead of using the mover, just to speed things up a little bit and organize things a little bit easier. So I just moved some of the files there manually using the terminal. Another thing to make note of, if you enable NFS, it disables the ability to use SMB multi-channel. I don't know if that's specifically an Unraid limitation. I think that applies elsewhere too. But SMB multi-channel, to explain that also, is a method of using multiple network links in order to speed up transfers. So if you were to have 2 Ethernet ports on your motherboard, and let's say they were both 1 gigabyte, this is on your client computer, your desktop, and your server was to have a 10 gig NIC. Normally you'd only be able to transfer at 1 gigabyte, as it would use one of those Ethernet ports to do the transfer to the server, and that would be your limitation unless you used LACP, but let's leave that aside for now. But SMB multi-channel will automatically adapt the transfer to use both NICs as long as they're both on the same network. So in the situation where you have said motherboard with 2 1 gigabit Ethernet ports, you'd be able to reach up to 2 gigabits. So another thing that I end up doing after I have all my items from the system share in one location is I change that, which you can see just to my left or to my right, this way. You can see just there, it says M&T user system Docker image. I changed that to mnt slash which pool it's on, which for me currently is Zulu slash system slash docker image. So I changed that user to Zulu because that is the pool that I put the share onto. It just makes doing things like updates makes that much quicker because it pulls from the images vdisk. It makes deploying containers a little bit quicker too. Fix common problems. Probably one of my favorite apps on Unraid. It prevents a lot of issues and it makes you aware of things that are preventative measures. Very, very helpful. I can't understate its importance enough. So there are a lot of things here that are personal processes. Me personally, I like to have my media shares split up so I don't have just one media share. At the same time, I don't, my rationale is I break up my shares based on the kind of data and the type of data that they're going to have. So for me, that's media large, media medium, media small. They happen to line up alphabetically too. Little thing there. And the reason I break these up like that is so I can move them between the array and the cache pool. So with the Zulu being an all SSD array, I would put media small there for sure because that'll be documents, small files, anything that requires, quick IO. If I'm doing a search on my documents, I don't want them to be on hard drives. It might take a while to do a search. Medium, that would be stuff that I would personally put in the couple megabytes range rather than thousands of documents. They would be music, stuff like that, stuff that I could set to be cached by the cache or maybe entirely on the Zulu cache. It depends. And media large would be my movies, TV shows, all of that stuff would be contained there. Another reason for doing this is if you're familiar with ZFS, there's a thing that you can do which is essentially putting the file table onto a separate set of disks. So doing this, if you move that file table onto Optane storage, let's say, that allows you to accelerate your hard drives in terms of looking up specific blocks. If you have a bunch of files like movies and whatnot, you may find that this helps you a lot, and it's particularly functional if you can separate them into your large pool and keep your items where you'll experience the need for speed, so to speak, more so on your smaller, faster pool. Another thing that I do is I split up my shares into cache read and cache write. Reason being that if you have the hardware topology for it, what you can do is put cache write on a write cache, a disk that you have set there to be brutalized and basically take the brunt of random writes that would, damage the disk, so to speak. And then cache read on a larger, let's say QLC disk, QLC drive, where you could read it. And also in the process of, let's say, qubit torrent, if it was to download an ISO and move it from one to the other automatically, which you can set, in the process of moving it, it would become defragmented, which helps a lot for later purposes. Oh, okay. I should probably explain this also. This is something I've taken for granted over time, which is sharing the shares. So network shares, you have to enable them for them to become shared over the network. It's ideal that you create the user first, then you create the share like I've done here, then you set the export to yes, and you change the security to either private or secure. If you click on the text to the left, it'll explain a little bit more. I always select private because the difference being that no one can read a share if it's set to private, but anyone can read a share if it's set to secure. However, they cannot write to secure unless they are a verified user. And another thing that I do is I go into Windows credentials and I set the IP address and the user credentials there, and it saves me from ever having to fill them in when I'm accessing the NAS. Now, Unraid works very well as a NAS. As you can see, it's very storage oriented, but it also works very well as an application server. Most people don't crucify me for this, but most people don't need high availability, at least not the target market for Unraid. Unraid is more home user oriented. You're really not going to find this running in many businesses. It's understandable. It's not oriented for that. And instead, use case, high availability isn't a top priority. So I'm going to be running multiple instances of radar. So this is specifically my 4K main radar, and I have named it as such. I have given it the entire media large folder, and I will name it as media large. You will find this repeated pattern in my configuration, reason being that if they are all set as media large, you escape the issue of having to do remote path mappings when you ask one container to talk to another container. You no longer need to do this if they are all set as media large. Or whatever share you wish to insert there. Another thing to do is to create a Docker network. Very easy. I personally named them. I named it DockerNet, not the most creative name, but hey, it works. It's a simple one-line command, and if I remember, I'll also leave that in the description. So here I am going through the motions. You can see I'm checking here that exclusive shares are enabled. This means it's bypassing Fuse, writing directly to the disks. Lots of fast IOPS. And system isn't set to exclusive here because some of the data is still on disk 4, as I mentioned earlier. Now, another thing I should mention. This is a personal preference. I don't want anyone to take it the wrong way. Linux server, binhex, itch777. They are all fantastic contributors. I have the personal preference of using HotIO's repository, and I recommend his containers, his images, I should say. Another thing that I do is here, be careful. There are, for people who are new to Docker containers in general, what happens is an image is created by one of these people that I've mentioned. And that image contains everything that is needed for the application to run. That image is put on the community application store, and that's what you select and you download. Now, here you're configuring the container. the container is essentially a reduction from said image. Think of it as the image being the printing press and the container being the printed book. Here you're changing some variables for said book. And for me, I changed 2 variables in particular, well, 3. The name of the container. It's ideally all lowercase. I prefer title case. It's fine, it doesn't matter. And the configuration path, I like to have the configuration path reflect the name, because these are separate, and the data path. So, image is the printing press, container is the printed book. Here I am changing the port for reasons that I'll explain later. I don't want to overload anyone who's particularly new to this with information. Yeah. Here I am going to the web UI, and please enable credentials and put those credentials immediately into your password manager, and set the IP address in your password manager so it fills in conveniently. Better to be secure right out of the gate than to procrastinate and have to do the same work down the line anyway. Fingers crossed nothing goes wrong here. This is I say it's my fifth attempt, but it's been a little bit longer than that. Sorry, a little bit more tedious than that. I see I'm 42 minutes in. Hopefully no issues. So here I am setting some settings. Okay, so here's the piece de resistance. I have gone about doing some digging into the documentation of both Plex and Jellyfin, as well as trying to make this human readable. I've settled on this naming scheme, which essentially allows for a lot of things. Instant matching with Plex. Plex's metadata analyzer, Plex's analysis tool, does a lot of ingenious work to figure out what the title is, right? And it works best if you help it. If you have just a few files, it'll do very well to select those files, and I believe it does so in terms of popularity. Like if you have a file, like if you have any video and you name it Dune and you put it into a folder that Plex is reading, if it's in a if it's in a movie folder, it will detect it as the first Dune, 2021. Or maybe it might detect it as Dune 1984 if you just name it Dune. Right. But it's not going to name it, detect it and match it to one of the more esoteric Dune movies. It'll do this based on every metric that you can imagine: the date it was last modified, the runtime, the other metadata details within the file. However, one of the most important things is the file name. You can save it a lot of work, a lot of CPU cycles by simply naming it correctly. So that's one thing. Another thing is that radar. I don't think that people should be managing their files on an individual level. I did it for a long time, and I personally am not going to go back to it. My first experiences with the RStack were unfortunate. I learned firsthand that automation can cut both ways. You can either make a big success or a very big mess. And I made a big mess of my library. However, now I know how to use it better and know how to make it suit my needs. So, something that this does is that if your content happens to have a release group, it'll set it in such a way that it is matched instantly with Plex and Jellyfin, almost 100% of the time, as like I want to say within 5 nines, thereabouts. And when it comes to the release group and importing or exporting these from one radar instance to another, I like to have the data itself stand alone. So thing you can do with with radar is embed the IMDb and TMDB IDs within the file name. This adheres to Plex's naming scheme. Plex uses IMDb. I believe it's been a while, but Jellyfin uses TMDB, and Jellyfin also accepts this within the subfolder name. So it should be films, which is what you pass into Plex or Jellyfin, followed by a subfolder for the movie and its contents. Most people just throw all their media into their films or TV show. Well, not so much TV show, but their films library. This is not recommended. So please bear with me. A lot of these changes are minor evolutions over time, but they serve the same purpose, and very few are just abstract choices. So the initial rundown, this is just me quickly going over it. I will try to leave a config file, perhaps, on Mega or some other hosting site and allow you guys to download, because the configuration is quite complex, especially when it comes to custom formats. But we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. So here I'm selecting media large and my films directory. Here we have another breakdown. So me personally, I break down my folders in the same way that I break down my media shares. So I have media large, medium, small, and specifically for this, I'm not going to keep, it's also recommended for radar, because radar can't handle more than one instance of a file at once. So if you want to have for example, if you buy a 4K Blu-ray, you'll be given a 4K HEVC version and a 1080p generally H.264 version. So you can't put them in the same subfolder in your film's library. Hence why I have this in between. So we have HEVC, 4K, main other. As you can see, the sorting of the codecs breaks down, then the resolution, then whether it's main or OF being, I can't remember if overflow, I think was the terminology that I used. Reason being that if you have your 4K file, that's fine when you're at home. 77 megabits, beautiful, crisp 4K stream. However, if you're watching 4K at a friend's house, you can have nearly the same quality of content by using Handbrake or something to transcode or re-encode, I should say, that file into a lower bitrate version. The reason I say re-encode rather than transcode is that transcode normally refers to on-the-fly codec shifting. This is generally very lossy and not very efficient. However, re-encoding generally implies that you're taking your time using CPU encoding, and this results in a much better quality video file getting spat out the other end, which you can then save here, and that will save you having to transcode multiple times for whoever wants to watch said video. So that's okay other, and this is me selecting the directory. And these aren't using the latest file naming, but as you can see, the IMDb ID and whatnot are in the folder name, which allows them to be matched very effectively. So this was a mistake. So there was an error made. I'm just going to quickly explain this. This was not supposed to be part of the tutorial, but here we are. There was an error made and I accidentally moved some TV shows into my films folder. Very unfortunate, but I was very easily able to rectify that by searching for TVDB ID and taking anything that matched that search and removing it, or sorry, not removing it, but moving it back into the correct subfolder. Okay, we're at the 50-minute mark. I think... yeah, so this is after I rectify that. And as you can see, all matches pretty well. So, another thing that I'll warn people against is quality profiles. I personally never use the any profile. I will only ever give it a specific resolution profile or not import it. So, I have to slow this down for myself. So this is just me explaining the naming scheme and how it follows the documentation for Plex primarily, followed by Jellyfin. And going back to the folder and importing all that stuff, as well as removing any extraneous quality profiles, because unfortunately I've had issues with accidentally, this is human error. I'd rather run multiple instances of radar and match them accordingly to the subfolder, given that it can only address one instance anyway, than risk selecting the incorrect quality profile and overwriting my data. So here we are, it's all importing under the Ultra HD quality profile, and I prefer the released minimum availability. Now you can select here whether you want to import both the movie and the collection. So for example, if importing X-Men Apocalypse here, that would import just the movie under movie only, but if I selected movie and collection, it would import the entire collection and check to see, check for the ones that are not available on my system. So there we have importing. Also, be careful. Once you click the import button, you need to wait for it to import all the items. If you don't, you very well could risk disrupting the import. For some reason, it's actually tied to the web interface. So there it is, just going through the motions of importing and scanning some of the files. And I don't know if I tackle Radar's naming just yet, but yeah. So here we address metadata. So Plex uses the Cody/MB metadata. So you just need to click enabled and hit save. So here's me essentially replicating that on Radar. I can't remember which one this is. Oh yes, the overflow radar. So do not change this number. This port number is internal. For anyone who doesn't frequently work with containers or Docker, the image that we previously referred to as the printing press creates a book that we refer to as the container, and that book, and this is where the analogy starts to break down, is unaware of the operating system that it's in. It is just cookie cutter. Now, they're part of the configuration that we put onto it, that you see me put onto it when I select a new app from the store, is telling the system what to map onto the book. So those variables are basically saying, hey, map this to this. map that to that. So the container here, radar, this instance of it, thinks it's running on port 7878, where in fact it is on Docker, but this is virtualized, and it is within its own little bubble. Outside of that, it's actually running on a different port. I can't remember what I set specifically for this, but it's running on a different port, that's for sure. So as far as I know, Hot.io's all his containers or Docker images have additional settings for things like WireGuard and VPNs. You can remove them if you do not feel like making use of them. So I'm just going through the motions here for other applications, and I think that day I got the meat and potatoes of the server set up. So let me check the timestamp here. Oh, not quite finished. Okay, so we're coming up at the 1 hour mark, and we've made it through about 45 minutes of video. I'm going to speed through it a little bit. So here's the naming scheme in effect again. Yes. So when it comes to radar and sonar, in order to perform the renames, please be very careful when you're doing this. This is what initially made me shy away from media automation. Don't do this hastily. Make sure that all your settings are correct for media management. In essence, when it comes to moving or renaming the files, first you have to rename the subfolder. And the way that you do that is relatively undocumented once again. You have to select the files and then hit edit and then change the root folder to its own current root folder. That renames the file. So I believe I go through that here. Yeah, so this is me changing the root folder or the files to itself. Please be careful if you have multiple root folders. Okay, so here we have renamed the subfolder. So that would be 13 Hours Secret Soldiers of Benghazi. Now, in order to rename the files within those subfolders, I then go and press the rename button. And that renames the files and the files that are alongside them. Please make sure not to do this prematurely. If you want to rename your files, make sure that you have done a scan, at least in recent history, of said root folder. Okay. So, qubittorrent has updated their methodology. If you want to get your qubittorrent initial credentials, you need to go and view the logs on boot up, and then go in and manually change the password in the user interface once you've logged in. So here is me adjusting some settings within qubittorrent. Setting most of them to automatic. This is much preferred in my mind. I can't see why you'd want to do some of that stuff manually. I can see why, but for as a general use case, you won't want to do that. So these are also shares that I've passed in manually, and I pass them in general using the share name to prevent needing to do remote path mappings. So the default path I set to uncategorized here because I don't want it to be a mess within the subfolder. Anything that is uncategorized, I want it in its own folder, and I can sort it out when I get to it. And the other things for all the R's, the radars and sonars, they will get their own individual subfolder to put data in. So here's the path on the file system. Make sure you have your slashes correct. It doesn't give you any warnings. And I use square brackets around the same name as the Docker container to bring it up to the top of the folder and let me know that this is a folder that is run via automation. Basically a visual separator, so to speak. And this is me repeating it for the radars and the sonars. And I go into radar, then settings, then connect. And here you can see I'm going to, oh, sorry, that's the wrong place. Radar, settings, download clients, and then I add BitTorrent as a download client. I change it from localhost here to the IP address of the server. However, if you use that single line to create a Docker network, instead you can access it using the name of the container and the internal container port, which is much better, and which is what I've adapted my system to use. So be careful with setting this up. Also be careful with automation. You don't want to go in and put all this stuff in and then just click away, and you go to bed and you wake up the next day with a terabyte or so of downloaded garbage. You don't want that. So measure twice, cut once. With Unraid, as far as I know, the file permissions are handled, or file access, I should say, is handled by the operating system. So when it comes to radar and sonar, they'll be writing files using like their application permissions, and that will push, by default, push files that are uneditable by users or unreadable or out of sync with what it should be with Unraid. You can fix this using the tools that are provided. However, you could also fix this by setting it to adjust the permissions within radar, sonar, and such. Set it to quad 7, I believe is correct. So here, chmod for the folder to quad 7. And you have to, of course, click the set permissions there and save changes. Okay, we're getting somewhere here. So here you can see that I quickly enabled advanced view, and that's where you can see the metrics for how much CPU and memory your Docker is using from your system. Okay, another thing that I'm mentioning here is that the order that applications start and shut down in is the same one that you're seeing here. So the utmost priority application in this organization is Binhex Crusader, and as you go down, those will be the ones that start up last, and it is reversed in terms of shutdown procedure. So this will start, then Crusader will start, then BitTorrent, then the first radar, then second radar, and so on, and it'll shut down in the reverse order. So keep this in mind when setting up applications that require like a Redis or Postgres database. And another thing to mention, on top of keeping the databases on top is that you can see on the right side, it says wait. You can put a wait in seconds, and this will postpone the initialization or the startup of that container until set timer has counted down. This is important for things like image that'll have a Postgres and Redis database. You want to make sure that those are both started and stable by the time image starts up. So things like Radar and Sonar, they have their own internal SQLite databases that you don't need to wait for. However, if you had something like Prowlar, QBitTorrent, you might want to set Prowlar to start up first, just so everything starts off smoothly. So for TV shows, Sonar has made use of a .plex match file. This is a custom file that allows Plex to not need to go in and do a whole bunch of media analysis to match your file. It'll go in, it'll see, hey, inside the initial subfolder, there's a .plex match file. I can just take this and know exactly what this subfolder relates to in terms of title matching. Which is fantastic. Saves a lot of CPU cycles. So I enable both the additional metadata for Kodi and XBMC as well as the Plex match file. So hopefully you should be wrapping up now. Thank you if you have made it this far. If you found this interesting, please like and subscribe. It takes a lot more effort than it seems. Unfortunately, I had to remake this video. Remake it at least 4 times. So hopefully this time all is well. So here we have the older naming scheme. Everything seems to match pretty well. The older naming scheme didn't properly account for release groups. The current one does, and I think it is the final one, touch wood. So once again, this is me waiting on that screen, even though things are sped up, until it boots me off, because it is tied to the actual ingestion of movies. So also, I like to have as much visual information on hand. So you can see here, my mouse is on the right, on top of that very small settings cogwheel that took me a long time to find. And when you click there, you get the option for viewing all of these when you are inside the title. So formats, that's something that you will be setting yourself, and I'll ideally be helping you with this stuff. I'll either add them individually or as text, or I will leave a config file for someone to import into their Unraid. So stuff like air date I find unnecessary, but having HDR, size, release group, all that stuff, I find that crucial. That's my personal preference. So here's my Plex configuration. Once again, I'm putting it in as media large, or passing through the share as media large. Now, specifically for Plex, you can see that on the left for the hot.io image, it says /transcode. So this one, I'm not going to put in the write cache as /write cache. I'm going to leave that one alone and put it in as the exact directory that I'm trying to write to for transcodes. So I'm gonna go ahead and skip past some of that. And you can see here that it is reading through the files. And here we have it perfectly matching all of these files because of the naming scheme. So that was me quickly going to check using a filter. So inside the library view, if you look at the top left, I'm in the library, and then also in the top bar, I'm also in the library rather than the recommendations. So in the top left, I'm going to select unmatched, not unwatched, and you can see that there are no unmatched because the naming scheme has done its job. And that's all she wrote for now. I think that settles it. Thank you guys if you have watched all the way to the end. I hope this has been endlessly fruitful for people. I hope people find this useful and this works for anyone who's trying to get into Unraid. Unraid can be a very performant application hosting software as well as NAS. And let me know in the comment section if there's anything that you are curious about. I know this isn't ideal because I'm dubbing over a tutorial that I made earlier. This is slightly longer than the original tutorial, but this is about right. There isn't anything else that I cover inside this other than perhaps don't enable all the extraneous features such as credits detection, video preview thumbnails. Don't enable them out of the gate. There are other changes to be made. Just import, allow it to just read and import the content in Plex right now, and hopefully I'll have better luck with the next video tutorial and we can go through editing the Plex XML for better performance and storage utilization. Okay. Thank you for checking this out, and I'll catch you guys next time.